for sure, for sure. No, and this pressure has been on Putin for quite a while now. We've talked about it before. But I want to make two, what I think are very important points, Danny. Number one is that Trump goes to great lengths to eviscerate the transatlantic relationship. And as he moves away from NATO, this creates a situation where the Europeans are to some extent on their own. So in a very important way, Trump is playing into the hands of the Russians here, because American security is no longer tied as tightly to European security as it was under Trump's predecessors. So you just want to keep that in mind as the transatlantic relationship phrase. It makes it more likely that the Russians would do this. The second point I would make is you want to remember that in the course of the war in Ukraine, the West has supported a Ukrainian invasion into Mother Russia. The Kursk offensive in the late summer of 2024. In other words, the Ukrainians, with support from the United States and from Britain, invaded Mother Russia. This was unthinkable during the Cold War. Unthinkable. Furthermore, as you well know, the Ukrainians, with assistance from the United States and from Britain, struck at one leg of Russia's strategic nuclear triad. Yeah. They struck at the bomber force, which is one of the three legs of Russia's nuclear triad. Again, this was unthinkable during the Cold War. And Karaganov is saying, and I think he's quite correct here, that people in the West have lost sight of the fact that we live in a nuclear world and that Russia is a nuclear armed power. And you just can't do anything you want to Russia and get away with it. And Karaganov's point is that Putin and others have failed to send that message to the West loudly and clearly. And as a result, the West, and here he's talking mainly about the Europeans today, as I said before, the West just thinks it can slap the Russians around and get away with it. And I actually think in that sense, Karaganov is right. I'm actually quite surprised at the extent to which the Western elites don't understand how dangerous a game they're playing with regard to the Russians. They think that Russian red lines don't mean anything. And Karaganov says this is true, and we have to rectify the situation. And his basic argument is there's only one way you rectify this situation, and that is you pop off a few nuclear weapons, and that will focus their minds. They'll come to realize that we live in a nuclear world, and you have to behave differently in a nuclear world than you behave in a non-nuclear world. So that, I think, is what's going on here. And all of this tells you that if people like General Hodges are right, and that we are now in a position where we can defeat the Russians, where the tide is being turned, they should understand that that greatly increases the chances that the Russians will turn to nuclear weapons.
And by the way, this is some of the others that I've talked to said many in Russia actually believe that last December there was an attack against Putin at his residence. Was an attempted assassination attempt by the Ukraine side while he was allegedly waiting for a phone call from President Trump. A lot of people have cast doubt on that in the West, but really the only thing that matters is what people in Russia believe. It almost doesn't even matter what was actually true, but that apparently is one of the things on top of that list that you just mentioned that has a lot of them animated on that direction here. I know you're running out of time here, so last question for you guys. One of the things that worries me about whether or not Russia would think about doing what used to be the unthinkable, even with the conventional level of actually striking something on NATO territory of military, which would definitely trigger an Article 5, is part of their calculation that, I can do math too, says the Russians, and I see all of these long-range missiles, all of these artillery rounds, all kinds of stuff, are armored vehicles, thousands and thousands of them you guys have sent into the graveyard in Ukraine and knocked out your own, especially of pack-free anti-aircraft missiles and air defense missiles of various kinds. You've dwindled your report numbers down. U.S. has dwindled our numbers down. And now then here, as you talked about at the top of the show, we've even further drawn them down in Iran. Russia say your ability to defend is a lot less than it used to be. And we, on the other hand, have been for years now with our industrial capacity building up inventories of everything like that. And maybe that might cause them to take a risk they might not have otherwise.
Well, I don't think that Karaganov and the Russians more generally are thinking in terms of winning the war by using conventional forces to strike into Western Europe or using nuclear weapons. I don't think that's what's going on here. What Karaganov is talking about is demonstrating to the West that you are willing to go up the escalation ladder. And that what you're going to do is you're going to put both sides in a situation, this is especially true if you use nuclear weapons, where the situation could spin out of control and we could all get incinerated. But we're just sending you a message, you the West, that the last clear chance to avoid disaster rests with you. And that means that you better cease and desist from thinking that you can supply Ukrainians or you can supply Ukraine with weapons that will allow them to defeat us on the battlefield. So it's more demonstrative in purpose than it is for winning the war. That's not what they're thinking about here. It's the way, by the way, we thought about using nuclear weapons during the Cold War. If the Warsaw Pact attacked in West Germany and was overrunning West Germany, we didn't think about using nuclear weapons as a way of winning the war. What we thought we would do was use nuclear weapons to demonstrate to the Warsaw Pact, or in this case, the Soviet Union, that we were deadly serious and that they better stop the war right away before we went up the escalation ladder. So it was that demonstrative effect that we're talking about. And I think that's what Karaganov is talking about. Although Karaganov does say that if the demonstrative use of nuclear weapons doesn't work, then we go up the escalation ladder. And I think he believes that at some point the West will back off because nobody wants to get incinerated. That's the basic logic here. Once somebody uses nuclear weapons, Karaganov would say, once those things are used, everybody will understand just how dangerous the situation is, and everybody will back off, right? Enough is enough. We don't want to be incinerated. So the Russians just have to use a few nuclear weapons to get us in that position. That's the logic here. I mean, I hope to God that doesn't happen. I want to be very clear on that, but I'm trying to explain as clearly as possible what's going on here.
Now, I've seen an additional reporting that some in Russia would say that before they hit the demonstration level of the tactical nuclear weapons, that they would strike conventional missiles at several military targets inside a number of NATO countries as a pre-step to saying that we're willing to go up the escalation ladder. And the next one is these nuclear weapons. So my question for you is, given what you know right now, especially with the hubris on the Western side, if conventional missiles land on NATO territories, and of course they'll immediately signal Article 5, are they going to get that message? Or do you think that we're going to ignore that and go up the escalation ladder ourselves and hit back at Russia, triggering potential nuclear war?
Well, the thing is that if the Russians were to launch a demonstrative conventional attack into, let's say, both Poland and Romania, there's no question that it would be clear that the next step up that ladder would be using nuclear weapons. There's enough public discourse on this, and the Russians would make that clear. The Russians, if they were smart, would say that this is the first step. It's not nuclear, but you want to understand that if this doesn't work, we'll go up the nuclear ladder. So we'd understand that. So then the question is, what do we do? What would you do? What would I do? We get hit with conventional weapons. We all understand the importance of an Article 5 guarantee. But at the same time, Danny, we understand that if we retaliate against Russia with conventional weapons, we decide that we're going to play tit for tat with them. That means in all likelihood that they will then turn to use nuclear weapons. And when they use nuclear weapons, what do we then do? Let's assume that they used 6 nuclear weapons. Would we then take 6 nuclear weapons and lob them back at Russia? It's the road you don't want to go down. I think anytime nuclear weapons are used, the incentives for everybody to just put a damper on things and step back and put an end to this before it spins out of control, the incentives to do that are just enormous. And of course, the Russians understand this. This is the logic that underpins Karagonov's position, right? That if they use nuclear weapons first, right, it's not like we're going to have any incentive to use nuclear weapons second. We're going to say, let's end this one. And again, you want to remember the Americans are trying to pull away from Europe as much as possible. So the Americans are not going to want to get involved in a nuclear war with Russia, or even get involved in a conventional war involving Ukraine. So the Russians, have a pretty strong hand to play here, which makes this, by the way, which is what makes this scary, right?
Yeah, well, it has me. And the scary part is the logic underneath it. Take the morality out of it. Take the what should or shouldn't happen out of it. But the fact that they have these cards to play, and if they have the will to use them and to, forgive the pun, play Russian roulette and say, I'm willing to go. Are you going to take the next round? I worry, and tell me if you think this is misplaced or not. I worry that there are too many hotheads in the West that would go, how dare they? There's no way we're going to back down now. We're not going to let those Ruskies get away with this. We are going to retaliate, or we want to. And when they say we, that really means France and UK or the United States, because that's the only ones that have those kind of cards to play. But do you think anybody else would fire off conventional missiles, whatever the targets were, that could then make them the target of the return fire?
I mean, who knows for sure? My guess is that there will be very few people in the West who will want to go up the escalation ladder, who will say, let's pull out a few nuclear weapons and now hit Mother Russia in return. I think the threat of nuclear escalation, which could end in annihilation for all of us, is powerful enough to cause almost all serious people to think about how to diffuse the situation, not escalate it. The problem that you face here, Danny, if you're playing the West's hand, is that there's no way you can win by escalating. It's not like you can use Western nuclear weapons to go up the escalation ladder and achieve a victory in a nuclear war, right? And
very important to understand.
Yeah. And just to unpack this just a bit more, the Russians, as I said to you, and we don't want to lose sight of this, the Russians are not using these nuclear weapons to win the war. That's what I said before. They use them for demonstrative purposes. To put it in Thomas Schelling's famous rhetoric, what you want to do is you want to throw both sides out on the slippery slope, right? That's what's happening here. When you have a limited use of nuclear weapons, you're in effect throwing both sides out on the slippery slope. And you're saying, in effect, we don't really know very well what the dynamics of escalation look like. And it is important to emphasize that. We've thankfully never had a war involving nuclear weapons between two states that have nuclear weapons of their own. So we don't know much about the dynamics of escalation here. And it could all end horribly. And the last clear chance to avoid disaster rests with you, the Europeans, or you, the Americans. And therefore, you better not go up the escalation ladder. And we then decide that we have to reach some sort of deal with the Russians about how to end the war in Ukraine. And if that happens, then Russia wins. It wins in the sense that it coerces. It doesn't win a military victory on the battlefield. It doesn't, achieve a splendid first strike with its nuclear arsenal. But what it does is with these demonstrative strikes, it coerces the Europeans and the Ukrainians and the United States into stopping the attacks against Russia and working out some sort of deal. And again, Karaganov's point is that if you look at how the West has treated escalation against Russia since this war started in February 2022, it's quite remarkable how little they care about our red lines. They think they can do things to us that neither side dreamed of doing to the other side in the Cold War. And as I said to you, not to beat a dead horse, as someone who grew up in the Cold War and paid an enormous amount of attention to these issues at that point in time, I, like Karaganov, am quite shocked at how cavalier so many people in the West are about striking targets inside of Mother Russia, number one. And number two, just talking about knocking Russia out of the ranks of the great powers. Just all sorts of people have been talking about that since the very beginning. I think that was the Biden administration's principal goal when the war started. I think General Austin, who of course was then Secretary of Defense, made this point clear. We wanted to knock the Russians out of the ranks of the great powers, and we wanted to do it with sanctions, but also with the Ukrainians on the battlefield. And I said to myself at the time, you really want to think about this. This is a nuclear-armed country that cares about its survival, and you're talking about knocking it out of the ranks of the great powers, and you don't think that might end up with a nuclear war? I don't know, but people were very cavalier. Again, that's Karaganov's point.
And they seem to still be there. Do you have time for one more question, or do you need to go? I know we're already over time.
Yeah, I have time for one more question.
Okay. We've been talking the theory here, but let's see if this actually came into play and they did fire off this limited number, and let's just hope and say it was only 3, maybe even only 1 someplace. Yeah. What happens on the physical territory wherever they might launch? One would presume a tactical nuclear weapon with limited explosive power. But what would happen on the ground where that happened, and the mentality of whatever country that was? How would they recover from that?
Well, it's hard to say exactly what the Russians would do if they were pushed to use nuclear weapons, just like it was difficult to say what we would do during the Cold War if the Warsaw Pact were overrunning West Germany and we decided that we were going to employ nuclear weapons. How many do you use? And where do you aim them at? Or what do you aim them at? My guess is that what you try to do is you try to minimize the casualties as much as possible. You don't use a very large nuclear weapon or a large number of nuclear weapons, maybe a few nuclear weapons, not terribly large yields, and then you target areas where there are not many people. And what you bank on in that circumstance is you bank on the fact that the mere use of nuclear weapons is enough to scare the living bejesus out of everybody.
As it well should.
Yeah, I believe that it would. Again, this is Karaganov's argument. And as scary as it is, there is a powerful logic behind it. And we want to appreciate that, as you certainly do. But it's the mere fact that nuclear weapons have been used and that the Russians have demonstrated that they're willing to use nuclear weapons because they think their survival is being threatened. That is all that is necessary. That would be the logic of the story I am telling, that you don't have to, hit a major town or a major city with a large number of nuclear weapons. You just have to use these things. That by itself is enough to reestablish deterrence. so to speak.
Do you think that Karaganov's comment on Glenn Deason's show was just him on his own, or do you think that it was with the knowledge of the Kremlin?
I don't think it was with the knowledge of the Kremlin. I think Karaganov is a big-time strategist. He's been around. He's my vintage. I knew him during the Cold War. And he is very influential, and he pretty much speaks his mind. He's the sort of person who I am sure tells Putin that he disagrees with him if he does disagree with him. He is not somebody who pulls his punches. And I would imagine that Putin appreciates the fact that he's so honest. But I'd be very surprised if he got permission. And the main reason I say this, Danny, is that he's been making this argument for a long time. As he told Glenn Deason, he was in the minority to begin with. Most people thought that he was wrong. It was just a bad idea. I would imagine most Russians were shocked by the idea at first. But what's happened with the passage of time is that more and more people now buy his argument. And one could argue that from Putin's point of view, or from the point of view of the Russian elite, it's a good thing for Karaganov to go on shows like Glenn's show and say what he did loudly and clearly, because it sends a signal to the West that the Russians are thinking about going down this road. And by the way, one very important element in this story, which I have not emphasized, but which you did emphasize quite correctly, is that Putin has been under a lot of pressure for a long period of time to play hardball with the West. Many people inside of Russia think that he has waged this war as if he were a pussycat, and he has not been tough enough with the West. And one can imagine that message has gotten through to Putin, and there's a lot of pressure on him now from outside and even from inside his own head, telling him that he has to get tough. And if that is true, and I would imagine it is true, Karaganov's message would be a powerful message to him.
In my view, John Mearsheimer's argument suggests that Trump's policies may sometimes produce outcomes that unintentionally align with Russia's strategic interests. Instead of weakening Moscow, certain U.S. decisions and approaches could end up giving Russia more room to maneuver and capitalize on Western missteps. I think this reflects a broader reality in international politics. Aggressive or confrontational strategies do not always lead to strategic advantage. Without long-term planning and careful calculation, major powers can easily find themselves in a weaker position than intended. What stands out is that Russia appears to benefit from divisions within the West, as well as from ongoing political and economic pressures faced by the United States and its allies. While Washington deals with internal polarization and prolonged geopolitical commitments, Moscow gains opportunities to adapt and strengthen its global position. In my opinion, the world is entering a phase where global power is no longer easily dominated by a single country as it once was. What do you think about Mearsheimer's assessment? Is Trump really playing into Russia's hands, or is this interpretation too simplistic? Share your thoughts in the comments below.
这个白天会死。